Okay, so we might get started. So welcome to everybody who's come online today to join us in this presentation. I'll just start with some housekeeping. So before that, my name's Nathan Beale, and I'm going to be the, I guess, the host in the background um, for this presentation today. So just in terms of some housekeeping, so if people could ensure their microphones are muted when not talking, and if you do have any comments or questions, if you can put them in the chat window or use your virtual hand. Um, Jim's planning on having a section approximately 20 minutes at the end for questions. So those questions you can save, that will be great, and that'll create some good conversation towards the end. But if there's anything which is really pressing, certainly feel free to put your hand up or put it in the chat. The session will be recorded and uploaded to YouTube. So that's for anyone here who wants to look at it again and reconnect with some of the ideas, or for those who are unable to make it, or those you wish to share it with as well. Now, there will be, if you'd like a certificate of attendance, please just drop me an email to beale@unisq.edu.au. I'll copy and paste that into the chat, and I will create some digital certificates of attendance for you, for those who have attended. Okay, so I think that's all the housekeeping. So I'd just like to welcome you to this professional development session called Practical Pedagogies for Common Challenges in Counselling Education. And today's session, Jim's going to help translate educational thinking into concrete teaching practices that actually work in our classroom and supervision spaces. So I'd just like to introduce our presenter, Dr. Jim Schirmer. Jim is a practitioner, educator, and researcher in counselling and psychotherapy with close to 15 years experience in teaching and supervising and practice and supervising emerging counsellors in tertiary settings. His research focuses on the personal development of therapists, particularly how positive personal qualities and virtues are cultivated and expressed in practice. Okay, so please join me in welcoming Dr. Jim Schirmer today. Over to you, Jim.
Thanks, Nathan, and thank you everyone for coming along today. Really lovely to see you. Is that Russell Wright in amongst there? Good to see you, Russ. Russ and I go back a long way, so it's lovely to see you. So, but to everyone, yeah, thanks for taking a bit of time out today. It's lovely to, be able to present a little bit on this area. The reason I sort of put my hand up for this, or certainly at the beginning of the year, I was in a meeting with Nathan and a few others looking at some of these professional development sessions around education. And I said, I'd love to hear something about pedagogy. And of course, as soon as I said that, then it was kind of like, oh, would you be interested in presenting it? So I said, all right, I'll give it a crack. And I will sort of kind of start by saying that I often introduce myself as a fake academic. And actually, if I put my slides up, you can kind of see I use the word doctor and also the word teacher in inverted commas. The word doctor in inverted commas, while I have had the honor of finishing a PhD, I regularly think about a line from Friends. And I'm going to just assume that most of you know Friends. I'm finding I'm having to explain my TV and film references to my students a lot more, but hopefully everyone knows the characters I'm talking about. But anyway, the scene is, Ross is taking Rachel into an emergency department. I think she's in labor. And he goes up to the front desk and he says, hi, I'm Dr. Ross Geller. And Rachel sort of whacks him on the arm and says, Ross, you can't say that. That means something here. And so I often think about that as sort of being a fake doctor. And then I also live with a teacher. So my wife's a primary school teacher. And so anytime I'm introduced as a teacher or a lecturer or an educator, I'm sort of aware I've never done a degree in education. I've never actually trained in that. And so I suppose I imagine my journey's somewhat similar to many of you, although some of you might have some really advanced pedagogical knowledge. But certainly from my point of view, I was a practitioner who became an educator, who became a researcher in that order. And as I sort of stepped more and more into the strange old world of academia, I found that, well, that's not everyone's journey. You know, some people come from you know, through the research angle and through other spaces. But talking a lot, particularly in counselling fields and therapeutic fields, I find a lot of people that become educators follow a similar route to what I did. And so what I'm hoping to share today are some of the things I picked up along the way by trial and error or by some happy accidents that have helped inform my teaching. But really as stimulus. I don't know if I can claim any expertise in particular. I suppose I wanted to share these stories, and in doing so, maybe open up some other stories that people want to share, or some other thoughts. So as Nathan said, I'm planning to present for probably about 35, 40 minutes, and then give us some space at the end, given that we're a lovely small group, to have some discussion. There might be questions, but equally love to hear people's thoughts. An image that's been going through my mind is sort of the image of looking under the hood. So for people like me, and maybe like yourselves, if you've sort of stepped into higher education, what a lot of people are influenced by, given that a lot of people in higher education aren't always, haven't always learned education as a profession or as a practice, we're often influenced by the way that we've been taught. All right. So people tend to repeat and teach the way that they've been taught. Now, that's not deterministic. It's not like that's where it stops, but that's often a high influence. And there's some value to this. You know, there's this model around the apprenticeship of observation, you know, the idea of being, well, by the time you step into the classroom as a teacher or an educator, you've likely had thousands of hours as a student. And so, you know, there is some things that you pick up along the way. You work out what works. You remember what's been beneficial, what's been influential. And so it's not to say that that's an invalid or even an ineffective way of learning your teaching craft. Anything that's worked just gets passed on by tradition. But there's that old phrase that, you know, that knowing how to drive is different from knowing how the car works, right? And so what you might have picked up and repeated through observation can also be enhanced by actually looking under the hood and discovering a bit more about how it works. And I think for me, that's what the value of pedagogy, that field of pedagogy, that field of understanding the theory of how people learn and how education happens, has helped. And it's particularly useful when something's not going right, when something isn't working in a classroom, or you're not getting the results that you're looking for, or something isn't quite working out the way that you thought it would, or there's a puzzling conundrum that this way of thinking and this study of pedagogy can often open up. So the other phrase that I have been thinking a lot about as I've been preparing about this is a phrase that I pass on to my students in a theories of counselling course that I've taught for a long time, which is the idea that there's nothing as practical as a good theory. And I think a lot of people within their fields, and certainly within the counselling fields, have often been able to find how practical theories are. Now, from my own point of view, the way that I view theory and the way that I understand how theory and practice relate is that a lot of theories actually emerge, or a lot of theories actually develop from the ground up. It's from people facing real life phenomena, people facing real life questions, and then they form questions, right? And by asking questions, they start to observe, and by observing, they notice patterns. And as those patterns begin to repeat and repeat and repeat and begin to become predictive, then all of a sudden you've got something abstract. You've got an idea or a concept that you can take from instance to instance, and it has some value in helping you understand what's going on there. And so in that way, you know, theory and practice have a co-directional relationship. One model of sort of theory is looking at sort of the architecture metaphor. You know, so if you think about a building, you've got a substructure, right? You've got foundations that often sit below the ground and that might be invisible unless you go looking for them. You've got an infrastructure, so you've got a whole bunch of things that make the building functional. You've got sort of structures, you've got wires, you've got pipes, you've got all of these things that actually make the building come to life or be able to work. And you've got a superstructure. In other words, you've got the thing that you see, you've got the visible element, you've got the facade, and you've got the walls, and you've got the architecture that's there. And so with any theory, and so if we're looking at pedagogy, with any practice of teaching and learning, what you can sort of unpick is all of those different levels, right? At one level, you've got the visible element of the theory or of the pedagogy. So you've got the thing that people see, the practice, the application. But often behind that, and what makes it work, is a theory, is actually some of that infrastructure, is some of the principles that guide that practice. And below that, and again, often invisible unless you go looking for it, there's some philosophical ideas that help to support it. And so that's kind of again, the idea of looking under the hood is what is most readily visible to us is the practice, is sort of the teaching practice in the classroom. But the more you go back and actually look at those other layers, those other elements of the architecture, the more you might be able to find things either to solve problems or enhance practice in that regard. Now, again, I feel like I'm probably preaching to the converted a little bit here, because a lot of people in their counselling work would have also found this as well, right? We would have technique or intervention that you see, but behind those interventions are theoretical principles, and behind those are philosophical assumptions. And so it's a very similar process, anyway, that I've found within pedagogy and within teaching and learning as well. But the last point I'll make about that before I give an example is that one of the things about architecture is that it's meant to be functional, right? The architecture of a home is different to the architecture of a commercial building, is different to the architecture of a place of worship, or any other sort of example that you want to give. And so the idea is that the form follows the function, where, you know, what the pressing question is helps us to know what sort of pedagogical building we're seeking to make, what sort of pedagogical space we're trying to create. And so the way I want to kind of approach this is to give a few examples of things that have come up for me as I've been educating counsellors over the last 10 or 15 years, and the journey that's then set me on to be able to, use some pedagogy to refine that. The first one, it really comes back to, a very common question or a very common function that we've got within higher education of counsellors, which is the fact that we're training practitioners, right? We're not just training, students of a discipline. We're actually training people to be able to go and do the work, right? There's a difference between saying, I'm a student of opera, or I'm a student of chess, to I'm an opera singer, or I'm a chess player. And so that's kind of the gap we're trying to bridge. Now, maybe with a quick show of hands, if I can look at the faces that are around me, who learned counselling skills through doing role plays? Nearly everyone. Yeah, you've had some element of learning listening skills through doing role plays. Now, I can't say this for sure, and I know that people are starting to use virtual reality and AI and different things in this space. But for most people, up until this point, right, role plays would have been just a core signature part of any counselling or psychotherapist training. One of my first sort of educational roles was going back, or major educational roles, going back to 2015. And I was asked to teach an advanced interpersonal skills subject in the Master of Counselling program at University of Queensland. And I had about 4 weeks notice before this came up, right? There was someone who was planning to teach that course, and then they pulled out, and I got a phone call saying, could you pick this up? So I jumped into it. And like I was saying before, I taught that course very much the way that I'd been taught it a number of years earlier, right? And a lot of that involved a couple of hours of lecturing and a 1-hour tutorial where students broke into groups of 3, right? Counsellor, client, and an observer, and they did role plays. Got to the end of semester and sort of, felt pretty good about the way it went. Student feedback was pretty good, and I had a good time with it all. And anyway, the next year I was asked at the beginning of the next year to help do the placement course, the practicum course in the same degree. So it was the same group of students. They'd finished their first year with their advanced interpersonal skills and then head into placement the next year. And a couple of weeks into placement, all of a sudden people were saying to me quite regularly, I'm really, really good at the first 15 minutes of a first counselling session, right? Because in an hour, when you've got 3 people to have a go, roughly you all get about 15 minutes to get to know the client, to ask a few questions, to do a bit of paraphrasing, do a bit of active listening. And they're going, and I'm now seeing clients, I'm meant to see them for an hour, and I don't know where to go next. Right. And so all of a sudden, my little naive bubble burst. I kind of went, oh, what was happening there? Right. I was doing role plays. That's what I'm meant to be doing. That's how people learn interpersonal skills. But then I had to sort of unpack and think a little bit about, well, obviously, as students step into placement, we need to actually do this a little bit better. So how we teach people to become practitioners? Well, part of it is, as we were talking about before, looking under the hood a little bit, right? So that superstructure, the learning activity that we're doing is, the role plays, that sort of practical experience. But probably the pedagogy that really informs it is something like experiential learning. And when you dive into experiential learning theory, what you find is that there's a structure to it, which is around that action comes first, right? This is how we learn. We do something. But the sort of learning that comes from it actually happens through observation and reflection and abstraction, right? So you actually take a point to see what happens, to ask some questions around it, to draw out learning from it, and to transfer that learning into new instances, right? And, there's a philosophical substructure underneath that, which is around, pragmatism, that connection between knowledge and experience, between theory and practice, but that real sense that learning is meant to be an active step. And I think it was that experiential learning bit in the middle that helped me give me some clues about, well, what's going on here? Why is it just that me sending students off to go and do role plays in triads, is leaving people feeling a bit stuck? And the way that I'd summarize what I picked up is actually to go to one of my other great loves, which is Australian football, and the great coach Ron Barassi, who used to say that practice does not make perfect. Practice makes permanent. In other words, what you keep practicing is what you're going to continue to do. And this is what my students were describing to me, is that we go, we do 15 minutes, we stop, we might say a word or two of what we liked or what we didn't like, and then we kind of keep repeating that and keep repeating that. And so role plays without an understanding of experiential learning risks just doing activity without learning coming from it, right? And so it's actually to the questions or the reflections that I went on was to think about, so how can we actually make that time more meaningful? Are people given, the sufficient time, the sufficient structure, the sufficient activities to actually be developing? So not just repeating, not just practice making permanent, but actually practice developing over and over again. Now, another little piece of the puzzle that helped me, I can't remember exactly where I first heard this, but it was this idea of a gradual release of responsibility model, right? So, the model looks something like this, which is that, at the start, there is when you're teaching a practice, and this emerged actually in primary school education. This model was used all around helping people learn to read. And so the idea is that initially there's more responsibility on the teacher, and less responsibility on the student. And what you're trying to do is gradually shift that, gradually move from one to another. And so, when I was thinking about that in light of the role play scenario, it was also reflecting on, well, if we just send students off and imagine that learning's just going to happen, all of a sudden we're jumping from the top of that diagram down to sort of the middle or the bottom. We're just saying, you go off and do it together, or you go off and do it alone. And so what I started to look at is across a semester or across a teaching period, how that responsibility is gradually released, right? So in the first instance, that there's a lot of modeling. There's actually a lot of explicit teaching of how do we do this, right? What does a role play look like? How do we actually make sure that, we have a structure to this? How do we reflect after a role play? And so that was a lot of modeling and a lot of demonstration that went along with that. Then there's that chance to actually start to do it together, right, with the student. So as students are doing this process, to be able to give feedback along to it, and little bit by little bit, actually introducing more and more responsibility for the student as time was going on. Now, some of that also involved a practical change within the course. So what we would do is actually meet for a 3-hour period together. And so with alternate fortnights, we would have sort of one fortnight, there was a lot of, teacher demonstration, watching role plays, input. The second week, instead of having 1 hour every week to practice, we would have a 3-hour practice block, right? So then people actually got the opportunity to do longer sessions, got the opportunity to do longer feedback. Got the opportunity to have me and other tutors come around and see them more often and give much more guidance. And so, from that, I say pedagogical idea, we could then put some practical things into play. So that's my first example. And as I say, had some, from what I thought was a good running of that first course, as it developed over the years, really kept on improving and improving. And then someone else took over that course and took it further even still. Let's have a quick check. Any quick questions at this point, or any comments that people wanted to make? Happy for me to keep powering on.
Can I just say,
yeah, please go, man.
I love this slide. And I think that it's just such a nicely set out progression of skill development, which shows the importance of our role as educators and how we need to companion for the first three kind of phases of that. And it's always interesting to me how educators will vary on their comfort in demonstrating for students as well. And I've even heard some educators say, well, I don't think that you should demonstrate for too long because can you monopolizing on this precious time that we've got such a finite thing, but it's such an important first phase of their learning. So yeah, I love the slide. It's great.
Yeah, thanks for that, Mary. And I think there is that element of I mean, there is that side to that comment though that's really important, which is if we do demonstrate for too long, we never actually hand over the responsibility as well. So that it's really a balance and reading those moments as we go through. So this is an alternative way of looking at it. I won't harp on too much around that. I'm happy to share slides as well, Nathan, if that would be useful. If people want to actually have a look at these. So the second question or a second example where I've been reflecting a bit on pedagogy. I mentioned before that I teach a theories course, and it's classically called something like Theories of Counselling. It's meant to be an introductory course to counselling and psychotherapeutic theory. It's meant to be a survey course, so you're sort of looking across all of those different classical traditions and major theorists. And the question that came up for me as I was teaching this course was around what you might call black box processes. So certainly something that absolutely perplexed me as I was studying counselling and even as I was sort of in my first years of practice, was when I would watch another practitioner work, there was this absolutely mysterious thing that would happen where a client would say something and the practitioner would respond with a question, with a comment, or with a paraphrase. And I'd have absolutely no idea how they came up with what they came up with, right? And so black box processes, most people are probably familiar with it, but it's those things where you've got a visible input on one end and a visible output on another end, and something happens in between that you don't understand. Now, for most of us in our everyday life, something like a search engine is a black box process, right? We put something into the search bar, comes back with a whole bunch of material. We don't know what happened in between, right? It's like it happens in a black box. Yeah. And so for me starting out and certainly talking with my students, there's a bunch of black box processes in learning counselling, all right? On the surface, it looks really simple, right? On the surface, people sort of, if you observe a good counsellor in action, you're like, wow, that looks as effortless as an everyday conversation. But as you would all know, there's a lot of stuff happening in between, but stuff that's not visible towards us. And so as I was teaching theory, I was really thinking hard about the way in which theory informs that process, the way in which theory helps us as a lens to perceive, to interpret, to inform our responses. And I was trying to think about how do I help students when they get to the end of a semester where they've studied theories of counselling, not just have some head knowledge about what Freud said or what Rogers said, what Fritz Perls said, or what Michael White said, but to actually think about how does that inform us in action. One of the pieces of the puzzle, or the pedagogical piece that came to me, again, through maybe a happy accident, it was through hearing a colleague at the university who was actually an educator in nursing give a presentation. They talked about this idea of a cognitive apprenticeship model. Now, if we're doing that sort of architecture piece, this really rests on maybe a socio-cultural philosophy. So the classic phrase that goes along that is learning gets caught as much as it gets taught. And when we think about apprenticeship learning, right, in academy learning, which is what a lot of universities do, you know, we mass deliver information, right? We have a group of people in front of us, and we, a bit like I'm doing now, is I just hope that I know what's going to stick. In an apprenticeship model, it's more about a master and apprentice, or, you know, in my family where we're obsessed with Star Wars, you could sort of have a Jedi and a Padawan, you know, and you walk along together as you learn through doing. And so there's all of these other ways of learning: modeling, coaching, scaffolding, articulating, you know, thinking aloud as you're doing something, active reflection, you know, exploring, transferring. And one of the things about this that I'll just sort of mention very, very quickly, this is what I think is brilliant about supervision, right? If you want to sort of look at a model of why does supervision work, or how does supervision work, you know, I think this is actually a really promising model in helping explain that supervision is a cognitive apprenticeship. But anyway, I sort of took these ideas, and I was like, well, this is actually what I'd love to do. This is to teach these sorts of black box processes. We're to create an environment where I'm using some of these more coaching, scaffolding, modeling. And the practices, right, so that superstructure that helped me to do this was the idea of a flipped classroom, which people might be familiar with it. So traditional classroom is, you know, people come to class and you provide them with information and content, and then they go away and on their own they do the more, let's say, complex tasks of synthesizing, of critically evaluating, of putting into practice. All right. The flipped classroom works in the other direction, where you sort of think around, if you can give people content, right? So that lower level of Bloom's taxonomy, but, you know, give people knowledge before they come to class, and then you use that time to be able to do the more complex pieces and walk people through the more complex pieces of critically evaluating, synthesizing, translating into practice, applying it to situations. And with something like theory, and in our program, we've also done this with the subject of ethics, it works really neatly because there's just some content that needs to get done. So in our instance, we use sort of online modules where people are introduced to the theories, they do some quizzes, they do some interactive activities so that they've got the concepts. And then when we arrive in class, I can then do really fun stuff. And I do find it very, very energizing, where I'm putting problems to them, right? Where we're almost working through a story over the semester, where we follow a client over several sessions. And, you know, this new thing comes up. How are we going to respond to this? Well, you've been learning about, you know, Gestalt theory this week. You know, what would be some hypotheses that you would, you know, generate? And so in the room, we're actually able to be doing, or able to simulate some of that cognitive apprenticeship sort of process. Now, combining that with some of that gradual release bit, you know, over the semester, I'm asking more and more of the students in that regard. And the assessment piece that we use for that course right at the end is an oral exam. So what the students do is that they come in, they actually, you know, with the examiner, they show a 10 or 15 minute excerpt of counselling role play that they've done. And then they've got to actually look at it through the lens of theory and answer questions through the lens of theory. What's going on there? What are your hypotheses? What would you do next? What would you find out about in connection to theory? And so it's one of the most energizing pieces of assessment that I also get to do, where you're really seeing students not just know theory, but know how do counsellors use that? How do they actually integrate that in that regard? Any questions, any thoughts, any comments around that element? If not,
I just love.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, please chip in.
I actually love.
Hi, Svetlana. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Nice to see you, mate.
Yeah, good to see you.
Yeah.
The oral exam at the end, I love that concept. I think it's because with all this AI stuff going on too, it's actually it's really enriching. I'm actually excited to potentially introduce that to some of the subjects. It'll be fantastic. No, thanks for sharing that. Very exciting.
No, definitely. And we've been working on for years. I think what it really simulates is a supervision session. But really bouncing off a piece of stimulus. As I say, it's time consuming. It takes half an hour for every student to do that process. But we're going to be spending time assessing anyway, right? Either we could be spending half an hour marking a multi-choice exam or an essay. I think this is a much more authentic piece, and also has the advantage of we get to see what the students know, because you can't sort of AI that in real time. All right, well, one last little piece. Anyway. Oh, sorry.
I said, well, not yet anyway.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I know. I was saying to Nathan earlier in the week, I feel like any prediction we make about AI will likely have egg on our face, right? This is so unpredictable. So I'm going to give you one more little bit for the next 5 minutes or 10 minutes, and then we'll, be able to have a bit longer conversation. The last one isn't so much about something that's particularly changed the way I practice, but more of, I guess, using pedagogy as a way of understanding a phenomenon. So when our students finish their program, usually the morning of their graduation, or maybe the day before if they've got an early graduation, we invite them to come together for one last chance to connect, have simple morning tea or that kind of thing. And we all sit in a big circle and we just give people the chance to share anything that they want to share to the group. And one of the things that regularly gets said year after year, and I imagine certainly we see it in the research about people learning counselling, but also I hear it from other practitioners, other educators like yourselves, is that people say something like, I haven't just learned how to be a professional. I also feel like I've changed as a person, right? And I see a few nods going around. I feel like I've changed as a person. And me being a slow learner, it took me a little while before I really pricked up my ears and started to think about what's going on there, right? I might be wrong, but I don't know if graduating pharmacists would necessarily say that. I don't know whether graduating engineers would necessarily say that. Again, I say that in ignorance. I might be wrong, but I think it's something interesting, isn't it? And so, again, I just sort of I looked around, and this is really some of my research as well, is around that personal development, that personal formation side of things. And there are some theories around that. People might be aware of transformative learning theory, for instance, which is really about that idea that some learning doesn't just involve getting a new idea or having a new skill, but there can be a deep shift in those things like the assumptions with which you approach the world, a deep shift in the schemas, a deep shift even in motivation, how you see people, how you see yourself. And one of the things about transformative learning, and I'll use this quote directly, right, is that learning environments become stages on which life-changing experiences can occur. And so often what transformative learning is saying is happening is that people are sort of taken to an edge, right? So it's a very experiential thing again. People are taken to an edge of what they think they know, and then they're exposed to something which stretches their frame of reference, right? And so in something like counselling, and I just saw a supervisee this morning, and and we were talking, I won't disclose any information, of course, but just they were talking about, say, a client's life experience that, again, is just really stretches you to think what's possible in human living, right? What are all these sorts of things that can happen to people, So, our students going out on placement, hearing people's life stories, hearing people's losses, hearing people's traumas, hearing people's dilemmas, hearing people's struggles, hearing people's mistakes, hearing all of these experiences. It stretches us. It asks us questions. A particular writer put this idea of kind of an emergence model, which is, again, that there's this shift that happens once we step into that real world of practice, that as we are, pushed into those more demanding experiences as part of training, what we observe, what we reflect can really, expand not just a skill set, but also a world view. And so certainly in that paper, they'll bring forward that, we need to prepare our students, but the more that we can get them into contact with the real material of the work, the more this sort of stuff will happen. That's kind of one answer to this question. Why is there this personal development? Well, because just as a necessary part of the experience, a necessary part of the professional practice, does put us into situations that stretch us, that stretch our worldview. And second answer is, I think, very interesting as well, which is that professional education is also a process of acculturation, right? And this probably goes back to that socio-learning theory that we talked about before. What gets caught along with what gets taught, right? And so there's all sorts of messages that get picked up as part of professional education across 2 or 3 years of a degree, for instance. You're in this environment where you're picking up on a culture, right? You're picking up on norms, you're picking up on values, you're picking up and receiving messages about what a human being is, what a human being can be, what a human being can become, who you are, what's important here, what are the priorities, right? All these norms and values that you're swimming in. And a really interesting little piece to this is this idea of a hidden curriculum. I'll read the quote again. Messages communicated by an organization, by an institution, by a program, apart from the official or public statements, the medium is the message, right? The message of the hidden curriculum, things like attitudes, values, beliefs, behaviors. So this really got me reflecting more than anything. It wasn't so much that I, then went about and did anything remarkably different in the classroom or with students, but it's just that idea that, along with the explicit messages that we're giving, students are picking up on a whole different range of things, right? A whole different range of attitudes, beliefs. So there's, I certainly believe this in the work that we're doing. I mean, there's a lot of role modeling that's going on, right? For better or for worse. There's a lot of things that students are picking up from observation, from tone, from implicit messages, along from the explicit. It's probably enough of me rabbiting on. I hope that gives you just a bit of an idea of, or a bit of stimulus, as I was saying before, around the way in which I think pedagogy has an interesting place within education to answer questions, to stimulate new ideas, solve problems, change practice. And so, yeah, happy to, I guess, cede the floor. And if other people have examples, comments, stories, thoughts that have emerged as you were listening to all that, it'd be great to have a discussion around it. Yeah. Any questions, any comments, any thoughts?
Jim, thank you. I really enjoyed that presentation. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, no, it's all right. I was just trying to find you on the screen. Yeah.
That's okay. Yeah, look, that was wonderful, and there were lots of points of resonance for me throughout, reinforcing, I guess, some of what I'm already doing, and also some points for me to go away and reflect on, I think, in terms of, well, you covered a lot. I think the idea of that reflection process that you go through when the students graduate, and that key thing that they often feedback is, that transformational learning experience is so true.
Yeah,
I
you hear
think
that too?
in my experience, and I think helping to sort of scaffold that for the students, I think is really helpful. But also this idea of the hidden curriculum. I think the students that I work with often comment on what they're picking up on in terms of the values and the behaviors that they're observing, that modeling that they're experiencing, and how powerful that is in their learning journey. So thanks for naming that and articulating that. It was really lovely to hear that.
Yeah, thanks for the feedback, and great to hear that resonates with, a lot of what you're seeing in your space as well.
Thanks. Actually, I did have a question. Sorry, I don't want to sort of dominate, but with the cognitive apprenticeship model, I'm not sure if others had a similar thought, but I wondered too about adding to that concept when we consider that when we're working in the room with our students, there's also an element around not just working cognitively, but working with in an embodied way. So I guess sort of extending on that, and I'd be interested to hear what other people would have to say on that. I haven't really thought that through, but that thought just occurred to me.
Yeah, I think there's there's a quick reply to that. Absolutely. I think there's a sense in which a lot of that translates into any of those black box processes, right? Anything which is invisible, which you can make a little bit more explicit to sort of talk through, how did I get from there to there, right? That's certainly a cognitive apprenticeship sort of piece. And you kind of, I even use the keep in my imagination, the mechanic or the plumber or the wherever you'd find an apprentice sort of model going, okay, we haven't seen this before. I'm going to show you how to do this, right? The first thing you do is the second. But sometimes that takes some really intentional thinking, because we might not always be sure why we're doing what we're doing either. And so there's that bit of actually stopping to go, all right, how did I get from there to there? When the client said that, what did I first pick up on? What was the connection I made? How did I then frame that question? And so to make all of that more explicit, again, whether that's also embodied bits, what was the first bit of data that I noticed from my body? How was then I then reflecting on that? What space did I make for it? Yeah.
Just following on from that, Jim, I think it's really interesting in terms of thinking about that in relation to kind of group supervision, in terms of the classroom being a kind of a group supervisory space. And this isn't particularly a question, it's more of a reflection that I teach on a postgrad counselling skills. And we've just changed the assessments, the first assessment, to being blogs, and then a assignment that reflects on their values and what they're bringing, and linking that to the ethical guidelines. And I think that's trying to make some of the implicit stuff more explicit. But I'm also then thinking, I really like the idea of developing their skills in the way you're talking about, and because it also coincides with us changing from 2-hour tutorials to 3-hour tutorials. And I can really see how we can do much more of that that will really support the developing practitioners to really sit with the deepening in of that experience with clients, rather than the surface kind of stuff, which is important, but it's equally, I think, one of the struggles that I find is really supporting the students to deepen in rather than staying on the surface. That's not really a question, but it's my reflection.
No, but it's a great thought. And I think I just love that, all of those thinking, because so often we just keep on repeating the same structures. And occasionally it is just every once in a while taking a step back going, hey, if we do it like this, which can sort of not be much of a change, you go, all of a sudden it enables all of these other things to actually take place. Be really fun. Yeah.
Jim, a question, I think, and really enjoyed the presentation and the style. When you speak about the flipped classroom, I'm kind of thinking of where we are, running tutorials around learning group processes, for example. So the tutorial is intended to be, that kind of flipped classroom style. We're going to get really experiential. You'll have done your reading beforehand. You'll have kind of gone through your material. And then life being life, some students turn up and they've done all of that, and others haven't, or others have done some and not all. And so you've got this kind of mixture. And whilst, obviously it's like, do it. You've got this mixture of students at different stages of having done the preparation. And I'm just curious to ask if you've got any particular strategies around that, about how you make best use of that experiential time then with that mixed level of knowledge.
Yeah, no, thanks for raising that, because it is a classic element of that model is that it's such a beautiful theory, and then how do you put it into practice in a way that works? I mean, some things really, as far as I see, is there needs to be some sort of incentive to do the work and to arrive having done the work. In the theories course I teach, it's marks, right? Is that part of those online modules is they do a short online quiz, and it contributes a fairly small bit of a mark, but it's something that, they get for doing the work. And if that's due before the next class, then that gets it along the way. But other people use other sort of mechanisms where it's actually just hard to keep up if you haven't done that work. So it's more of that natural consequence, so to speak, is that, you do sort of feel that bit behind. But then I think there's also, just that thing of, as you're walking in, you're also thinking, if someone hasn't quite got the knowledge part, how am I going to help catch them up while still keeping the process going? So then there's a practical bit in terms of how you deliver as well. Yeah. There's a scattergun of thoughts. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks, Jim.
Hey, hi, Jim. How you going?
It's so good to see you, mate.
Yeah. In that situation too, I've found doing like expectation management, like what are people hoping to get from this? Because what they expect and what they get is the level of disappointment. So verbalizing that and taking note of it, people feel like, oh, you're considering them. The other thing is how to you cater for the different learning styles, and particularly with more neurodivergent sort of participants being involved. How do you do that?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's sort of a big piece within that. I mean, one of the things I think that I also put into the midst of that, and I don't know if it's particularly teaching postgrad students that enable this. I'm interested to hear from others that teach in other sorts of spaces as well, is also, creating an environment of understanding, well, what is it I do? What is it you do? So certainly from where we're starting, and we talk about expectations, from the first time I meet students, I'm talking a bit about, well, what are my expectations for myself? What is it that I'm expecting from you? What is it I'm asking for you? And so around that, when you've got someone that's got a particular learning style, if you've got someone who's got, neurodiversity within that, I'm hoping to enter into a conversation around that of, what is it that you need? What is it that you need from me? What is it that's, your self-knowledge too? So in terms of you understanding yourself and how you learn, and what is it that you bring to the classroom? So I know that's not a once for all answer, but often that's the kind of conversation I'm hoping to have. Yeah. Were there any questions or any comments in the chat? Just comments. Yeah. Otherwise, we might be getting towards the end of the space. Yeah.
Sure. Okay, great. Okay, well, thank you, Jim, and really interesting and engaging discussion. And certainly you flagged a number of theories that I think we're all thinking, gee whiz, I wish we'd known that when we first started. And I wish we'd known about that.
Likewise.
And also that same type of thing where you, at times when you have that thinking, here's where the students are, here's where they need to be, how do I support them to get there? And is what I'm doing actually helping? So in some ways, what you're doing is actually giving us an example of what we teach our students, which is intentional practice. So understand the frameworks, understand what you're aiming to do, and then reflective practice. Is what I'm doing actually helping? Is actually supporting me? And obviously the theoretical frameworks help us to make sense of it and help work out when we look at it and analyze it. So look, I think that, and it's useful also, I thought that in terms of giving ideas, not just on here's the frameworks, but here's some of the ways that it might be considered, here's where you might consider how it might look in actual delivery. So I'm sure there's people probably taking down notes thinking, oh, I'm going to go back and think about, some of these potential ideas and also reflect them into other contexts as well.
Yeah.
I'll just check with Willow. Willow, you've got your hand up. You've got a
Hello.
file.
Thank you so much for this. Not only is your personal and professional experience feels really valuable to me, it's also being part of a group for whom it's is equally important. For them, it's Friday. I'm sure we've all got marking and semester prep to do, but this feels like the most important place for me to be right now. So I'm curious if you'll be offering more, if there's an opportunity for us to gather together again.
Nathan?
Yeah, look, that was perfect timing, because I was just about to say, if you are an educator, a counselling educator, or you teach counselling students, or a tutor, or a sessional, or a continuing staff member, we do have a group called the Australian Counselling and Psychotherapy Academics Group, and it's specifically for people who are involved in training counsellors. So you might be training at the TAFE level, or the diploma level, the degree level, the master's level, the graduate diploma level, whatever level. So you're most welcome. If you want to join our mailing list, we have an emailing list. So just feel free to email me at beal@unisq.edu.au. This group's not actually a LinkedIn with UniSQ. It's an independent group with various other academics who join us. And then we've also got a LinkedIn group as well. So again, you can email me if you want to be part of that. Then it's a closed group, but just so educators can have a space to talk about things which are of relevance, as well as share when trainings come up. So our next one next month we'll have a network meeting where it's an open meeting where educators can come and just talk about whatever is topical and whatever people might be wanting to discuss. And then the following month, we'll be having another one, which I'll be advertising soon in terms of a professional development event. So thank you all for making the time. And thank you, Jim. Really appreciate you volunteering your time to come and talk to us and provide some counselling education to the educators. And really appreciate that. And looking forward to seeing what some of the results of this might be in terms of the people's teaching, as well as seeing people in future PDs. So thanks all.
Nathan, just quickly, because it's recorded, do you post the link in the closed LinkedIn group?
I can, and it'll also, for those, if I forget, feel free to let me know. Otherwise, it'll be the YouTube one will be on the National Heads of Counselling and Psychotherapy Education site, so or the NHCPE. So if someone likes to type that in, NHCPE is the group where the YouTube site where these types of recordings get posted. Okay, so the ACPA, which is the Australian Counselling and Psychotherapy Academics Group, that's where sort of subsidiary of the National Heads of Counselling and Psychotherapy Education Group. Okay, thanks all, and good to see you, and see you next time.